Hi, so let's continue our discussion about the age of discovery and the new worlds. So, as the Europeans are pushing across the ocean in search of trade products, eventually they make their way to the island nation of Japan. Japan at this time is ruled by about 300 daimyos. Daimyos are feudal lords, and the problem with this is they often fight amongst themselves. The daimyos had samurai underneath them who did their fighting for them. Anyway, it's going to take three great centralizers to unite Japan. The first guy was Oda Nobunaga. Oda Nobunaga was one of the daimyos who waged war against his other daimyos. He used muskets that were first brought by the Portuguese. He would have his swordsmiths copy the musket and equip his army with them. Anyway, Oda was on the verge of victory when he was assassinated, and it was left to his subordinate, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, to unify Japan. Hideyoshi was actually started off as a peasant, and it was Oda Nobunaga that kept promoting him just because he would do any task that Oda assigned him. Pretty ugly little dude. A lot of his enemies called him Lord Monkey. They said he looked like a monkey. But anyway, Hideyoshi was a very good general, and he conquered the rest of Japan. And then he invaded Korea, where he would later die. So it was left to the third general, another daimyo by the name of Tokugawa Ieyasu. And Ieyasu would say he only wants to rule all of Japan, got them out of Korea, and he would create what would be known as the Tokugawa shogunate. A shogun is a military ruler, and the Tokugawa family would rule Japan for about the next 300 years. And they would isolate Japan to try to limit influences from outside. I'll get to that a little bit later. Kabuki is Japanese theater, and haiku is Japanese poetry. This is traditional Japanese theater and poetry. The Portuguese brought Christianity to Japan. Many daimyos and their populations, especially in the southern islands, converted to Christianity, but later on, Tokugawa Ieyasu would ban the religion and persecute all the Christians and drive the Portuguese missionaries out. Shinto is the traditional religion of Japan. It's a blend of animism, which is spirit worship, called kamis, and worship of the emperor. And from China would come Buddhism, and one of the things that the Japanese would kind of adapt to their culture would be Zen Buddhism, which is a lot about the beauty of nature and meditation. But as I mentioned, Tokugawa began banning outsiders. He only let the Dutch come into the closed city of Nagasaki. Nagasaki is a port city, and there was a little island called Deshima where the Dutch were allowed to trade. Basically, Japan does it different from China. They leave the door cracked so that they could see what was going on in the outside world. If they wanted something that they thought was good, they could let it into Japan. But if they wanted to keep something out, like Christianity, they could ban it. So Deshima was kind of like Japan's window to the West, where the door that they cracked just slightly open. What about the Americas? Well, we mentioned that Columbus landed, and the first people he discovered were the Taino Indians, who lived in this region of the Caribbean, mostly agricultural, hunter-gatherers. They were no match for the Spanish. Many of them would succumb to Spanish diseases. Europeans brought with them measles and smallpox, not on purpose, but long living in isolation. Native Americans had no immunity to these diseases. Africans, Asians, they were in greater contact with Europe. In fact, many diseases came from Asia or other regions of the world. But by then, the Europeans had carried a lot of these symptoms with them, and the Native Americans would be decimated by them. And I'll get into that more when I talk about the Columbian Exchange. Conquistadors or Spanish conquerors. These are guys on the make. They're looking to make money. They're spreading God's word, but at the same time, they're looking to get rich and become famous. and there would be many of them. Well, one such conqueror was Hernando Cortez. And Cortez, he landed in Mexico from Cuba with, I don't know, maybe 500 Spaniards. The first thing he did was burn his ships, telling his men, we're either going to conquer or we're not going back. They had been marching towards Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Indians. The Aztecs were pretty brutal, and they were also very, very rich. Malinche was a Native American who was given by Montezuma as a slave. Cortez took her as his mistress. They would later have a child together. Malinche would be Cortez's interpreter and advisor. She's kind of controversial figure in Mexican history. Was she a hero or was she a villain? I don't know. Montezuma was the great speaker of the Aztecs, which means he was the leader. At first he thought Cortez was a god, but later on Cortez would hold him captive and force his people to give up their riches. Eventually Montezuma was killed. Cortez had to fight his way out of the city, but he'd later come back and conquer the city. Similarly, the Incas, who were in South America, mostly as Peru or Bolivia, their capital was Cusco. They were conquered by another conquistador by the name of Francisco Pizarro. Marching south from Panama through the Andes, he came across the Inca Atahualpa. Atahualpa was the leader of the Incas, and he captured him. Atahualpa knew that the Spaniards thirsted for gold and silver. The Incas had plenty, so he asked Pizarro if he filled this massive room with gold and silver, would Pizarro let him go? And Pizarro said sure, and so he had his people fill a room, but then Pizarro had him strangled. There was so much wealth, especially from the Incas' lands. There's a mine, actually a mountain of silver known as Potosi, that was mined for several centuries. Anyway, there was so much wealth coming from these new Spanish lands that the Spanish galleons would carry it in convoys from Cartagena, which is today in Venezuela, to, it might be Colombia, but anyway, it's to Havana, Cuba, from Cuba back to Madrid. So because these galleons were so rich, it attracted privateers, which were pretty much pirate ships, but most of them were given a license by the King of France, or the King of England, or the Queen of England, or the Dutch. Most of them were Protestant, looking at the Catholic Spanish as kind of fair game, and looking to get rich off of these galleons. To govern these regions, the Spanish sent out viceroys, who were like royal governors. At first there were two, one in South America and one in Mexico City, but then they added two more to govern it a little bit more fair, a little bit more equitable. So they put one down in Argentina, another one in like Colombia, Caracas, Venezuela. Anyway, hand in hand with the royal governors were the Jesuit missionaries who arrived to convert the people. Many of the Native Americans would convert to Catholicism. The Jesuits were there to kind of bring the light of God to the people. At first, the Spanish set up a system called encomiendas, where these were large, like plantations or estates that were given to the Spanish, and they were given Native Americans to work them as serfs. But one Jesuit by the name of Bartolome de las Casas didn't like this system. These peons, as they were called, these serfs, these poor people, were kept in perpetual poverty. And he argued that the Native Americans were good people who never did Christians any harm. And the Spanish conquest was unjust, and these encomiendas were wrong. And while eventually Bartolome got the king to reverse course on the encomiendas, the damage had been done to Native American communities, and many of them were dying of diseases, or they were split from their communities and they had to hire themselves off as wage laborers. To replace Native Americans who did not make good workers. First of all, Native American men didn't farm. They looked at that as women's work, and to tell them to farm was something they just didn't want to do. Second of all, they ran off and blended in with the population. They would run into the jungles, the woods, of the forests. And third of all, as I mentioned, they died of diseases. So the Portuguese and the Spanish began importing African slaves. African men were used to agricultural work. They grew yams or palms. They had an immunity to European diseases because of their contact with the Europeans. And they really had a hard trouble running off into the jungles and forests, although there would be exceptions, and I'll get to that maybe a little later. Anyway, what they created in the New World was a caste system based on race. At the top were the Peninsulares. These were people born in the Iberian Peninsula, born in Spain, born in Portugal. So they were white, Europeans, born in Europe. Underneath them were the Creoles. They would be Europeans, but they were born in the New World. So they were a little bit lower class. In fact, Creoles are eventually going to be the ones that lead Latin America and even in the United States to independence. When you think of our founding fathers, guys like George Washington, he was a Creole. He was English, but he was born in America. And the English that were born in England kind of looked down their noses at the Creoles. Underneath those were the mestizos. Mestizos are mixed race between Europeans and Native Americans. Eventually, they're going to be the largest growing class. Underneath those were mulattoes. Those are European and African mixture. So if you were half white and half African, you were considered a mulatto. Then you had your Native Americans, and finally at the bottom, you had your Africans. Back then, women, and for a long time, they'd wear like a little beauty mark. You might have heard somebody say, oh, that mole on your cheek is a perfect beauty mark. They would actually glue black velvet to their cheek. So if you were, for instance, a mestizo, you'd say, all right, I'm a mestizo, but I'm a lighter mestizo than other mestizos, so therefore I'm a higher class. And so when you're marrying your daughter, you wanted to marry her to a higher mestizo, or a mulatto, or even a Creole. So anyway, race was important in governing the empire. In North America, New France was discovered really by Jacques Cartier, who sailed down the St. Lawrence River. There wasn't a lot of products. I mean, one was cod, which is off Nova Scotia, but the big one was fur trade. That was the big money maker. So the French had pretty decent relations with the Native Americans. Meanwhile, the English brought more settlers. Jamestown was the first over here in Virginia in 1607. Later, the Pilgrims, who were basically people seeking religious freedom, came to Massachusetts and created the Mayflower Compact. St. Mary's County was right behind them, 1630s. So some say St. Mary's County was the third. At the very least, it was the fourth English settlement in the New World. Again, they were Catholics seeking religious freedom. So most of these pilgrims, these people, came here seeking religious freedom. Because England had far more settlers than the French, there were often disputes into the lands they claimed. This would lead in the 1750s to what we call the French and Indian War. The rest of Europe called it the 7 Years' War. Basically, it was the French and their Native American allies against the English and the colonists. This kind of set the stage for our American Revolution. But at that time, we were on the side of the British. This picture, which you see up there, I have hanging in my living room. It took place in Pennsylvania, and it was a major battle in the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris would settle the French and Indian War. The French had to get out of Canada, where their descendants still live in Quebec. And you go to Quebec, like Montreal, you speak French. They speak both French and English. But England also got everything west, like the Missouri region. The French got to keep a couple sugar islands in the Caribbean, so they definitely got the the tail end of the Treaty of Paris, the worst part of the deal. Lastly, I got time. No, I don't. I'm done.